at the Washington and Lee University when he was drafted into the U.S. Army. After returning from a tour of duty in Vietnam and winning a Rockefeller Scholarship, which he took to Harvard, Steck made the decision to spend his career moving between academic and non-academic assignments, including political media consulting. So we're very fortunate to have our panelists here today to talk about message management, the fundamentals of creating a campaign message, and the importance of managing a good relationship with the press. So we'll begin with Melissa, and we'll go from Melissa to Dr. Parker and then to Dr. Steck.
The opposite.
Oh, the opposite.
Yeah. He's Jay's batting.
Okay, so Jay's batting last. Okay. All right. Thank you, Melissa. Go ahead.
Good morning. So I want to just kind of expand on what Eric was saying earlier, and I've done a couple of campaigns and been in Republican politics for quite some time. And then I also have experience on the congressional side of things, which I think is really important when you're talking about campaigning, because you don't want someone, I mean, you definitely need a campaign strategy, but it's also really helpful to know how that campaign strategy will transition once you get into office. And whether it's a state office or a congressional office, I think you can't underestimate the importance of carrying your message or transitioning your message into your office. So I'm just going to go very broad, speak for a few moments, and then turn it over to Bob, and we'll talk a little bit more about his background in speechwriting, and then we'll go to Jay, and we'll talk a little bit more about paid media and the theory behind campaigning. So I'm going to start by just asking an initial question. And that first question is, when you are, sitting in Iraq, or when you're on a tour of duty and you're thinking about, wow, I want to run for office. I mean, the first thing, you get back to the United States, you're at the dinner table, you're talking with some friends, you say, you know what, I had all of these thoughts while I was on my tour, and this is what I'm thinking. Like, these are the reasons why I want to run for Congress. This is why I want to affect change. The one thing you really need to start to examine is, what is your objective? Why you? Can you make a list of all of the reasons that you want to help your constituents or the people in your community, whatever office it is that you're running for, whether it be a community office, local office, state office, or a national office. So, you want to ask the first question, what is my objective and what do I want to achieve? Not only that, but why am I the best person? Why am I the most qualified? And why do I relate to the people that I'm going to represent? I think it's really important to identify that right up front. And, even if you just start a very basic list, I think that really kind of starts to help you create your message. And then I think it's really important that we say up front, we've all talked about this, and I know this from firsthand experience, as do they, not running for office, but being in the military, and I, because I worked with Senator McCain. But I think the first thing that you want to know is that just because you're a veteran, it doesn't, that doesn't mean that you are the best person on education or the best person on taxes. So I think it's really important to take that into consideration. I mean, I think military service is so significant, and there's no words to express how important and how necessary it is, but at the same time, it's not something that can define your campaign platform, and I want to make sure I say that up front. So as you start to identify your objectives, identify why it is that you're qualified, then you want to do some initial polling. And I think the initial polling begins with your friends, your family, your coworkers, people at the supermarket. You start to figure out why, what the things are that are important in that, what those things are that are important in each community. What are the values that the people in this community have? What do your constituents care about? And once you start the initial polling, you probably want to turn it over to a professional polling firm that can tell you the results of their surveys and say, you might have thought that taxes were important to this community when in all actuality it's really education or it's healthcare or who knows what the issue is for that group of people. And you've done the polling and you're starting to think more about your campaign, and then you get to this point where you say, well, what is this message that everybody talks about? You know, I had friends yesterday that I was talking to about this presentation, and a friend of mine said to me, well, what is your message? I mean, your campaign platform, your motto, the theme in your ads, and, you know, it's all of the above. It's all of the above. I mean, your message has to permeate, you know, all of those channels and all of those mediums. So you start to think about your message, and I like to talk about it as a house. You have kind of your message house, and the roof of the house is your overall theme, your overall campaign platform. What is it that you're running on? Is it that you are a pro-defense Republican or Democrat, or independent for that matter? Is it that you are all about low taxes? I mean, whatever it is, it's a very, very general, very, very simple theme. And then you can start to break that down into the what, the why, and the how. And you can kind of go down deeper and talk about the facts, you know, have some anecdotes to support that. You have your proof points. But the most important thing to remember about your message is that it has to be clear and concise. It has to be consistent. It has to be connecting. The voters have to connect and be persuaded by your message. And it has to be credible. And I think that's probably the most important point that we'll make about the message today, is that it has to be credible. I mean, you have to have something to back that up. And then you want to ask yourself, can people act on my message? Is there a specific call to action? Is there something that people can do to affect change solely based on the message that I have communicated? And then sometimes your message is going to change, and you have to be nimble and ready to roll with the punches and be able to change your message at any point. For example, a lot of times you run a little bit differently in the primary and versus the general, where, you know, in the primary you're running kind of one campaign, and then in the general you have to transition a little bit to get the other side. So, you know, if you're running only with Republicans, you're going to be running on certain issues, and then if you're trying to sway the Democrats, then you've got to kind of soften a little on some of your issues. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind. And then also, there are unforeseen events that happen. The economic crisis of 2008 is a perfect example. And you sometimes have to retool your message based on current events. So now that we've talked about the message generally, you want to identify your audience. And the one thing I can tell you about that is that your opponent is your most critical audience. So you're speaking to your opponent before you're speaking to any of your voters, because the opponent knows more about you than you know about you. And I'll bring up another point there. You might want to have someone that is on your staff that knows every deep, dark secret you could ever have. Sometimes the people on your staff and your opposition research team is able to find out more about you than you thought you knew. And it's very interesting, you know, you have to have all of that information. You know, maybe you had an ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, you know, who was involved in who knows what, but, you know, you never knew about it, but then all of a sudden it shows up on an attack ad from your opponent, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, where did this come from? So as much as you can find out about your background and as much as you know about yourself, the more you know about yourself, the better. So you've identified your audience, you know what the message is, and what are the tools that you use to communicate that? How do you put your strategy to work? And we're going to talk about some of those in more detail as we go through the session, but I'm just going to mention a few right up front, and the first two are earned and paid media, and we're going to talk about the differences between earned and paid media, and then grassroots organizing. You also want to talk about the way that your words play into your message and how to kind of put your words together to be able to communicate throughout several different channels. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who is going to talk about how to put the stump speech together and why repetition is so important.
Thanks. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I want to pick up on that, on the stump speech, and also something else that she said. When you're going through this checklist, like why am I running for office, one of the things you really want to look at is why am I in a position best able to bring about whatever change it is that I dreamt up when I was over in Fallujah or wherever I was. but I'm also aware that it's sort of mid-morning and there's often a sort of a slump, and so I want to do something really riveting. We're going to talk about Aristotle. And you'll see the reason in a second, okay? Just bear with me for a second. Aristotle really took this seriously. He wrote a famous book called On Rhetoric, and he asked himself this simple question: what tools does the speaker have to convince the audience? And he identified three. First, logos, which of course just means the logic, the content, if you wish, of your speech. Second was pathos, which is just the Greek word for emotion. And third, and this is the one that he really talked about the most, and this is what Melissa alluded to as well, was something called ethos. Ethos is the word from which we get both ethnic and ethics. And it basically is who you are. There's a great quotation from Emerson. He says, "Who you are stands above you and speaks so loudly, I can hardly hear what you're saying." Roger Ailes, who many of you might know is the head of Fox News, was a campaign manager, a pretty damn successful one actually, and he wrote a book that summarized it. He said, "You are the message." So I want to talk about that for a second in the military context, because that's where all of you and some of us come from. And there was actually a medieval, later than that, captain in the 30-year war named Motacicolo. And Motacicolo tried to make Aristotle's basic framework for rhetorical success adaptable to the field commander. And so he talked about how you have to use logos, our cause is just, this war is necessary. You have to use pathos, that is, you want to appeal to the fact that soldiers don't want to be viewed as cowards, they don't want to be viewed as shirking their duty, etc. But then the main thing he said was ethos. And here's what he said about the field commander talking to the troops. Quote, "Let the captain show that he himself is lighthearted and full of hope by means of his facial expression, his words, and his dress. His face should be severe, his eyes intrepid and luminous, and the clothing flamboyant. He should banter with his men. He should be witty. He should be clever, because they will then deduce that their general could not jest and enjoy himself like that if there were any real danger, if he did not think that he was much stronger, if he did not have good reason to scorn the enemy." Let's see if anybody in more recent times has taken that to heart. Can we just look at this video? Somewhere in the control room? I see there's a lot of action up there. Some of you might recognize this.
Good. Hut! You seated? I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Now, an army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, fights as a team. This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap. The bilious bastards who wrote that stuff about individuality for the Saturday Evening Post don't know anything more about real battle than they do about fornicating.
Okay, let's stop it there, since we're about to get X-rated here on a Saturday morning. Don't want to do that. But you get the point, and most of you have probably seen the whole thing. But, I mean, I can assure you that, as you know, Patton knew his military history extremely well. I'm sure that he read Modus Ottolenghi. I'm not an historian of that, but I'm sure that he did. And I can also assure you that he had gone to a lot of work to put those remarks together, even though it looked really spontaneous. He understood what Mark Twain meant when he said, it takes at least 2 weeks to prepare a good impromptu speech. It's worthwhile remembering that. But you're not going to. Now you're out of the military context. You're thinking about running into the political context. And it is still going to be the case that who you are stands above you and speaks so loudly that it'll be hard for people to hear what you're saying. And Melissa brought this up. The very fact that you're a veteran is a question mark rather than an exclamation point, at least at the beginning. Because if you think about it, we don't, however much we like to talk about how much we revere the service and so on, we often do not elect the veteran. Obama's not a veteran. He beat a war hero. John Kerry was clearly on the ground, lost to a man who was basically always stateside. Now, there were a lot of other issues going on, but I think there are various things that you have to neutralize about your identity to turn it into a positive. And one of them is what you want is to be viewed as one of them, that is, the them here is the voters, it's the citizens, and so on. And so what you want to do is to find the commonality between your status as a veteran and their status as citizens who probably didn't serve. I mean, I think it's only about 2/3 of 1% who have served in the Army since we've got into these 2 wars, or served in the military, to the other services. And so there's going to be a certain reserve. You all know this when you first are identified as a veteran. And it seems to me that one way to do that would be to talk about the continuities that you have. This is what Melissa was talking about when she talked about connection. What are the continuities that you have? What is the connection that you have? If you can talk about how those of you who are cops on the beat and walk the streets every day, those of you who teach in the 3rd grade, those of you who are down at the firehouse, those of you who are earning an honest living and making jobs for other people, those of you who work at the bank around the corner, not the hedge funds up in New York, all of you know about service. And all of you have served. I have served. We all know about service. Those other guys, by the way, they've either forgotten about it or they never knew what it was. I mean, that's the implicit thing. So there's a lot of reasons why, as a veteran, you're going to be viewed with a certain mixed emotions, put it that way. Samuel Johnson once said, a man thinks more meanly of himself if he has never been a soldier or gone to sea. Well, in a certain sense, the very fact that you're veterans will cause some in the audience to think, I'm not a veteran, I feel a little bit embarrassed by that, but on the other hand, if this guy is brought down by somebody else, then I don't need to feel that way. See what I'm saying? It's a tough concept. I'll just close by reiterating what Melissa said, and that is you have to have a stump speech which you say over and over and over again in some fashion or other. The main themes need to stay there. But you need to deliver it in a way each time that it looks as though, wow, It just came to me. I just, you might be sick unto the death of it. Your audience is just now starting to pay attention. Let me close with one quick anecdote that I think kind of spells this out. Back when General Westmoreland was the commandant of West Point, he invited General MacArthur back and he told him beforehand, he said, General MacArthur, don't prepare any remarks. I just want to introduce you to the class, and you can, and have them show their appreciation for your great service to the country. So, sure enough, at the assembly, Westmoreland highlighted MacArthur's career, and then said, well, General MacArthur, I know you haven't developed any remarks, but if you wanted to say anything to the class, you could. So MacArthur got up and delivered himself of this absolutely brilliant speech that closed like this. In my dreams, I hear again the crash of guns, the rattle of musketry, the strange, mournful mutter of the battlefield. But in the evening of my memory, I come back to West Point, always there echoes and re-echoes, duty, honor, country. Today marks my final roll call with you, but I want you to know that when I cross the river, my last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps and the Corps and the Corps. Well, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, or almost none. Mrs. Westmoreland reached over to Mrs. MacArthur and said, that was just the most moving speech I've ever heard. Mrs. MacArthur said, yeah, it's hard for me to get too emotional. I've heard it about 35 times. What's going to work, what's not going to work, you can figure that out intuitively, but Jay knows how to bring science to that question, science to how you figure out your message, what's working, what's not working, and how to develop it from there. So, Jay, go for it.
Okay, good morning. I'm supposed to bring science here, but a lot of what I'll talk about is actually going to be more art. And by way of background, I spent about 6 years as a political media consultant. I was media director for House races, Senate races, governor's races, and just to make it more interesting, this was as a Democrat in Barry Goldwater's home state. It was a very intense experience, so intense that to get a break, I joined the Army and went to airborne school and didn't come back for 26 years. But one of the things that afforded me was, first of all, an opportunity to kind of reflect on a lot of the points that we're talking about here, both as a member of the West Point faculty, spent a good number of years in psychological operations and director of PSYOP training at Bragg, and then came back after I retired and worked on the presidential campaign with Veterans for Obama. I was in 7 different states and worked in a number of different primaries. And what really struck me after those 30 years was not all the things that were new, but those things that hadn't changed, those things that were still at the core of campaigning in general and this issue of message in particular. Let me start off and being professorial, because that's what I do. Let me pose some numbers for you and see if anybody can tell me what these numbers represent. We'll find out who actually did the reading last night. I see all the former cadets in the room just kind of shrinking down like this. The numbers are 60, 4, and 1. Can anybody tell me what those 3 numbers represent? I feel like Dan Aykroyd in Ghostbusters. You never studied. In 2006, more veterans were candidates for office, for Congress in particular, than had been in the trenches in the campaigns since the end of World War II, when it was virtually unheard of not to have veterans on the ticket on both parties. 60 candidates. Bear in mind, this was a time when the issue of the war in Iraq was particularly salient. One of those points in our history where when voters were polled, they were asked, what are the most important issues you're going to vote on? And a national security and defense issue was consistently number 1 or number 2. These candidates were actively recruited and supported by both parties. 60 candidates. 4 represents the number who were actually elected. 1 is the number of Iraq-Afghanistan war veterans, individuals who had actually served in Iraq and Afghanistan. As some of you know, that one was Pat Murphy from Pennsylvania. 1 out of 60. Now, math was never one of my better subjects, but that's not a large percentage. In fact, after the 2006 election, where, again, this question of national security and defense was at the forefront, and in fact, a number of things about the administration's policy changed. Secretary Rumsfeld was replaced by Secretary Gates. After all that, when they calculated the number of veterans in Congress, there was, in fact, a net loss. That tells me several things and highlights a number of points that empirically come up again and again and again. First and foremost is that being a veteran is not a solid foundation for your campaign. In fact, being a veteran can be the most problematic part of your identity when you are running for office. Furthermore, being a veteran cannot in and of itself be your message. There are a number of things that you, I'm sure, are, or if you're not, you should be aware of about the political environment now, since this is no longer 2006. Can somebody tell me what the unemployment rate is among young Iraq, Afghanistan veterans? Been in the news a lot lately. 17%. Yeah, 17%. That's, even in the current economy, that's pretty substantial. Some numbers even go higher than that, and in certain urban areas, the number approaches 25%. Did anyone see the recent poll done of employers as to why they are not hiring vets? Well, first of all, the employers start out with what you would expect. We honor veteran service. We hold veterans in very high regard. You've all seen the public opinion polls where military and members of the military are consistently rated higher than any other public institution, much higher than Congress, although that's frankly not setting the bar very high. And all the employers reflected that view, but a number of them said, but, you know, you've got that whole PTSD thing, you know, the ticking time bomb. Now, Bob and I are old enough to remember the post-Vietnam era when this was a staple of popular culture. Whether it accurately reflected the behavior and mindset and personality of most veterans didn't matter. This was what was in people's minds. The second point that you have to contend with is that in the minds of many people, the war is over. Now, we all know that's not the case, but it's faded from the public view. In fact, you will hear many of those in active duty reflect on whether or not the American public is even aware we're at war anymore. And that means there are certain expectations, like, okay, where is my peace dividend? How are you going to cut, particularly given the state of the overall deficit, how are you going to cut defense spending? And because you are a veteran, do I have to worry about the fact that your knee-jerk default setting is going to be to keep defense costs where they are, or worse, raise them? You have a problem of defining just exactly what a veteran is. Bob noted the fact that there's a fraction of people in this country who are veterans or have even any regular contact with them through family or through work. There are a whole host of things out there, not just the veteran as Rambo ticking time bomb, but there's a lot of uncertainty out there as to just who you are, and it's been defined for you by other people before you ever enter into the race. And it's difficult to separate your identity and your message from preconceived ideas that have already been formed. And related to that is that your experience is very distant from those of a lot of individuals. One anecdote, and I know that an N of 1 does not equal a convincing data set, but nonetheless, coincidentally yesterday at Georgetown, where I have my day job, I overheard one of my graduate students talking to someone on the administration of the program about how she'd just become engaged. Her fiance is in third Special Forces Group, currently in Afghanistan, and she is getting ready to move to Southern Pines so that when he returns, they can get married before he goes back again in 7 months. Now, all of us in the room are familiar with this constant cycle of coming back and going and coming back and going, and what it means when you're gone. The reaction of the individual who was talking to her said, "Oh, good, so when you're married, that means you can go back with him, right?" No, this is not Germany in 1980. This is still Afghanistan. But in the minds of many people, the experience that you know and the reality that has become second nature to you no longer applies. So let me just restate what Bob and Melissa have said, and part of our mantra here this morning. Being a veteran can be one of the most difficult, problematic aspects of your campaign. And if you're building your campaign around the fact that you are a veteran, you need to seriously reassess how you have structured that campaign and how you're presenting yourself. Let me just talk in some general terms about message building and the process of thinking through what your message is. First and foremost, whatever the message is, it's got to be yours. And you're going to be, and many of you already have been through this, or are right now, under a lot of pressure and a lot of input and a lot of helpful advice from not just family and friends, but from professionals, some of whom are extraordinarily good at this business, but I am here to tell you, have absolutely no clue as to how to assist a veteran, be you Republican or Democrat, when you're running for office. And in fact, some of the postmortems on the 2006 election highlight the fact that in many of these candidates who lost, and some of them spectacularly so, were actually following some of the best, and I might add most expensive advice out there. If you always have to bear in mind also that if you don't define the message, someone will. As I've already stated, and to stress again, by virtue of the fact that you're a veteran, there's a framework out there that sort of establishes a message about who you are, what you believe, what you stand for, what your views are already that you may have to overcome. Now, I wouldn't be able to maintain my position in the secret league of professors if I didn't at least assign some readings while I'm here. Those of you who have not seen the book Our Army, I hope I'm getting the title right, by Jason Dempsey, you owe it to yourself to get on Amazon.com and get a copy. It is the first substantive, in-depth, empirical study of political attitudes among those serving in the military in decades. And interestingly enough, and I'm still not quite sure how Jason did this, it's based on surveys that were, in fact, drawn from military data and involved surveys of serving members of the military. I won't spoil the ending for you, but needless to say, as will not come as a surprise to you, but will come as a surprise to many voters, the image many people have of the political attitudes, views, and beliefs of those in the military is not consistent with what is actually out there. So you have to be aware of what messages are already being posted out there, and bear in mind that it's not something you can let kind of define itself. It's also something that you've got to sustain. And in sustaining it, bearing in mind, as Melissa said, you have to be clear, you have to be credible, you have to be consistent, and you also have to connect. Your message has to be something that the voters who you are attempting to convince can actually connect to what it is that you are saying and what you're talking about. At the core level, in terms of what their beliefs are, what their fears are, what they see as the biggest threats to their day-to-day life, be it global terrorism or unemployment or environmental factors or whatever's going on in your district. So in knowing the message, you've got to know who you're talking to and understand how to frame things in ways that they can grasp. But really at the core of all this is the old maxim that you have to know yourself. Some of this involves sitting down with the people who know the absolute worst about you, be it your best friend, your spouse, your roommate, your ranger buddy. What are all the things that are possible weaknesses? You have to take everything that you assume is positive and may well be and analyze it from the standpoint of how that could be turned into a negative, because frankly that's the most common tactic. And the experiences that John Kerry had in 2004 are nothing new. John McCain experienced this in the primaries in 2000. Others did it before them. The positive aspect of noble service as a veteran can end up being turned against you. So you have to be able to look at that with a very clear and objective eye. But beyond all those things that you feel you can control and you can define, and beyond those things that are already sort of out there by virtue of the fact that you're a veteran and whatever other professional or community identity you have, there are other things that are present that you have to be aware of that frankly were not an issue if there was one thing that substantively changed in 30 years, that were frankly not an issue even 2 or 3 elections ago. Simply put, you need to Google yourself. And when I say Google yourself, it's not just for the obvious, like when I discovered that there's someone with my name who's wanted for armed robbery in the state of Ohio, so clearly I can't run for Congress in Ohio anytime soon. But how are you being depicted and presented, even if those people depicting and presenting you are doing so in what they think are favorable terms? What is the way in which your message is seen outside of your own campaign, and how do you have to react to and interact with that on a very real and very daily basis? Bearing in mind that once you get into the campaign, you are living the message. Every appearance you make, every bit of media, be it earned or paid, every picture that is taken of you, every off-the-cuff utterance, and by the way, if it hasn't been said here already, and we'll probably reinforce it several times here, there's no such thing as off the record. Every utterance that you make is going to be measured against the way in which you have presented yourself. So you have to constantly be aware of and be monitoring that. And as you do that, you have to ensure that you're not in an echo chamber. The longer you get into a campaign and the further you get down the road, it's amazing the level of self-deception and denial that can take place. Campaigns that are stunned, how could we possibly have lost, when every poll showed that you were down like 7-1 for quite some time. You have to be very careful about not getting in the echo chamber. And spoiler alert, you're going to be in the echo chamber. So how are you going to think of that in terms of your actual message? You also have to be mindful of how you've crafted that message and the way in which it's construed in shorthand. Be it your stump speech, be it your bumper sticker. Never allow yourself to think that issues are as simple as they are sometimes being depicted by your campaign or by others who are depicting your message for you. Let me just kind of wrap up here before we go to the Q&A with just a couple of points to consider about the message, not only how it's constructed, but how it's sustained, how it's adapted and changed over time. At the end of the day, this is a balancing act. You have to be timely and rooted in the events of here and now, but you also have to be forward-looking. You're running for office because you intend to govern. As I believe it was Melissa said, whatever you do has to have some reach out to the future, a better future that the voters see and that you're presenting. You have to be responsive and reactive to events and to issues, but you can't allow that defensive, responsive mode to take you away from being in a position to take the initiative and to use the message to set the terms of the campaign. You have to be campaign-centered, but you also have to bear in mind that other individuals, notably the voters, are not living and breathing the campaign every day. What is it that average people care about? And when they think about voting, which is 5th or 6th on their list, even though it's number 1 for you, what is it that's uppermost, and how is that affecting the way they hear you? And you also have to be mindful of the fact that whatever you do with technology has to be still rooted in what individuals who are the target of your message can understand. A lot of people ran out in the last couple of elections and said, hey, we have a website and we're online and we're doing all this cool stuff, and that was pretty much the sum total of their new media strategy. Some of them were doing really forward-looking approaches to campaign communication that will be spectacular when they're used in elections in 2018. But do not allow technology to drive what you do. And if you're using technology, make sure you know what it is that technology does and how it affects things. That balancing act, that process of staying clear and coherent and consistent and above all else credible, is going to consume the full weight of your attention. And you're going to have to do it in a strategic sense, not viewing each action, tactical step as a self-contained entity. And you're going to have to keep a vision of the bigger picture as you do. Let me stop there and we'll go to whatever it is we're going to do next.
All right.
Well, I'll take a quick jump at that. It's a good question. I would guess that at one level, the questions are going to be the same, the problems are going to be the same, which we've all talked about, and that is to take that identity of yourself as a veteran and make sure that it's shaped in a way that connects with voters and doesn't put them off. The only thing I can see in the difference in terms of length of service would be that you need probably, if you've been in 20 or 30 years, to talk about the diversity of ways in which you've served, the places that you've served, and what you've learned from those, so that people don't sort of get the impression, well, he's been away or she's been away from anything that we would call the real world for so long. How could they possibly know? You know, you could talk about the education problems that you've had on Army bases or Navy stations or whatever. I don't know whether you guys have a...
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, in the minds of many voters and the press, with all due respect to the press that's here, and some of my best friends are reporters and I'm a recovering journalist, it doesn't matter if you were a private for 2 years or you were in for 30, you are now an expert. And in fact, some of you have probably seen campaigns where someone who was a Spec 4 and spent their entire time in the safe, warm headquarters close to the coffee pot, they have no hesitation about framing the national security strategy and talking in terms of their vast military experience about what we should do in, Iran. You want to kind of avoid that. You want to kind of avoid being the person who takes your veterans label and extends that to give you a degree of credibility that frankly is beyond what you should be doing and is going to be pretty easily knocked down by an opposing candidate. I think each individual, though, I don't think you can always divide it up by like I was in for 20, I was in for 30 or what have you. Having said that, the longer you're in, the more difficult it is. The longer you were on active duty, ask Wes Clark what the, private residences in the White House look like. He's not going to know. And in fact, if you go back and look at, for example, presidents, the assumption is that military service and professional military leaders are always going to have an advantage. But in fact, George Washington, Zachary Taylor, and Dwight Eisenhower, and Washington is questionable because he did other things other than be commander-in-chief, are really the only true professional, full career soldiers who have ever served in the White House. And the numbers in other offices are even fewer. The 20-year mark, what you have to do is kind of assess your situation. Are you coming back to your hometown, a place that you've kept contact with, where your family is still living? There's a congressional candidate in New York right now who just retired, brigade commander in the 82nd Airborne, 23, 24 years service, but he already has a connection to and an identity with that community. The other side of that, though, from a negative standpoint that you have to be aware of, other than the positive things you might be able to stress, is what are the things that happen in your career that you're talking broadly about and that you want to reflect on your skills and your background that can turn on you. How many of you know who Pete Dawkins is? Ever heard the name? I mean, a resume anyone would envy. Rhodes Scholar, first in his class, Heisman Trophy winner, one-star general, got out of the military, went to New Jersey, runs for Senate against a candidate who was in serious trouble before Dawkins shows up. Dawkins gets slaughtered. One of the things that he had stressed was, look, in my vast military experience, I've run large operations, I've been in charge of aspects of communities like being a mayor, I've dealt with environmental problems. The television ad that then started running about a week later was about an EPA judgment that was levied against Fort Ord as they were going through base closure for some horrendous amount of money. And even though Dawkins was long gone from then, and Dawkins had nothing to do with the environmental cleanup of Fort Ord, it immediately became a source of media attention and his opponent's attention that, hey, you're claiming you have all this environmental experience and yet you were the deputy base commander at Fort Ord. You know, clearly you're not really an environmentalist. So there's baggage that comes with that, and you've just got to be aware what it is and be prepared for it.
And I just want to say quickly, I think it's really important, like you were saying earlier, to the issue, just to recognize the fact that the issues are going to be the same. So what's important to your voters is the thing that is the most important to you. So whether you're a veteran or not, you still have to be meeting the needs of your voters, and you still have to be cognizant of the issues that are important to them.
I sure as hell hope not. I mean, I don't have any expertise.
Wow, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
There's a recurring phenomenon in politics where if you are running or if you're managing a campaign, everything is referenced to something that happened in the last election. Well, we can't do that because look what happened in the Pennsylvania primary for state legislature. Never mind that you're running for county commissioner in California. This just will not work. Or this person was a veteran and they got beat. I don't think it's the kind of thing where there is a stigma attached to veterans, but I think there still is, and I saw it in the campaign when I was involved in, and had conversations with friends in the other party who saw the same thing. Just a level of discomfort may be too strong a word, but uncertainty of what a veteran is and how to deal with their campaign. Among media consultants, among professional campaign managers, among fundraisers. You may have to kind of operate under the assumption that by being a veteran, and I think part of our message here today is go in assuming that this is not all positive and you've got to be aware of the downsides of it. You may have to spend a considerable amount of time not just crafting your message for the sake of your voters, but educating and acculturating the people who work for your campaign, who may passionately support you but just don't get or understand this aspect of you, what that means. Kind of the happy conclusion of all these negative things about being a veteran is you can make it a positive, but you have to be aware of it, you have to own it, and you have to be aware of the level of misperceptions, ignorance, mythologies, whatever you want to call it, with the people you're working with. Those of you, how many of you out there are already running, or already declared or about to? You've probably already run up against the kind of thing where there's something, whether it's a veteran or something else, where somebody's told you, well, you're not really a good candidate because of whatever. You've got to have an answer for that. And you're going to get asked that question on, or given that advice on a lot of different points. If you can't come up with a sound answer for that as it relates to your status as a veteran, you need to, pull back and spend a couple of days rethinking who you are and why you're running and what it is you want to say. But if you've got an answer for that, you can overcome that perception or that obstacle.
Well, and I'm just going to add to that something that I thought about is that this upcoming cycle, I think it's going to be even more difficult to run as a pro-defense either candidate with the just the huge amount of pressure that we have now on the DoD budget. So, I mean, that's something that you want to consider as you're formulating your answers and your message.
May I just add one quick thing, and that is, it seems to me that if you wear your service lightly, you've got a much better chance. And let me try to give you an example of that. I mean, and I'm not going to reveal my partisanship here, but when Kerry came out at the Democratic National Convention and said something like Lieutenant Kerry reporting for duty, that was not light. On the other hand, and I told Melissa this, when during the last campaign, I think it was Mrs. Clinton made some reference to Woodstock, and John McCain said, that must have been a great experience. I didn't attend. I was tied up at the time. I thought that was really a light way and a very funny way to do it.
So did he.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I was going to ask if that was your line.
No, I told Melissa in an email, I don't know whether that was your line or not, but claim it.
Yeah.
Well, I think this comes back to just formulating your message. And, not having served in the military myself, you all may have a different perspective, but coming from a media angle, this is where you block and bridge. And you kind of block the negative and try to go back to your message. So I think it really, that's something that you need to consider when you're formulating your initial campaign message, your overarching theme. And you have to find a way to continually to transition from that negative and find a way to turn it into a positive without knowing exactly what it is you're referring to. It's a little bit more difficult for me to speak to that, but I think it's always about finding a way to connect the dots back to your original message.
Well, but in that case, remember, they were very, very slow. Bob Schrum, who's usually very smart, is a very inside the beltway kind of guy. And I think Schrum thought, this is absurd. This is a war hero, and they're trying to undercut that. That doesn't even deserve a response. So they gave the other side the month of August. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a huge mistake, and I'm not sure whether Bob will agree with that or not. But I think that's a big thing. You got to get back there in the same news cycle.
Yeah. It's those of you who've seen the documentary War Room know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. The whole driving principle behind the War Room and the Clinton campaign, the one that was run by Carville and Stephanopoulos, was you've got to keep dominance of the news cycle. When the news cycle is done at the end and they tally it up, you have to be the one most visible in control of the message. That news cycle is much, much, much shorter than it used to be.
And it's going to continue to get shorter.
And it's going to continue to shrink. The only thing kind of working in your favor is the fact that we're dealing with information overload, and people have already begun this process of kind of balkanizing, only going to, or dividing up, going to those things that are media outlets and media messages that already confirm what they already think. And that can work against you as well. The rule of thumb, whether you're talking military service or anything, is if there's bad news, they need to hear it from you. They need to hear it from you before they even ask for it. They need to hear it from you enough times that it almost becomes information that nobody cares about. Dude, did you hear that, Clinton smoked weed? Yeah, you're the last person to hear that. And you also need to own up to it and be honest about your human frailties and your failings, because people will understand that if you're honest about it. Yeah, you smoked weed. Don't say you didn't inhale. You know, and, you know, I'm the Democrat here. I'm the guy that showed up in jeans with no tie. So I can say this. The reality is that everybody has something in their past that they're not particularly proud of, and occasionally things they're ashamed of. And in some cases, those are the things that motivated them to get into public service and to try and make things better, redeem themselves, whatever you want to call it. And you have to be prepared to kind of put that out there. When it's something that requires additional explanation, and it's something where you may assume everybody will know that this is BS, don't assume that. There's an old saw that comes from a joke that Lyndon Johnson used to tell, which I will not repeat because I don't think there's any part of it that isn't crude. But the bottom line is you put out information not because you can confirm it, but because you want to hear the other person deny it. And that by denying it, you're kind of raising the visibility. In the current media market, there's no way you can say, I'm going to keep this quiet by not responding to it. You have to respond. It has to be something that ideally you've already addressed. It has to, as Melissa has pointed out, has to somehow be connected. The dots have to be drawn back to your message so you get back on point. You know, above all else, they've got to hear it from you. And this doesn't matter whether we're talking about veterans issues or anything. Yeah, Melissa, how does someone who is in the Navy and didn't really have a... Would you know of any cases like that and how it might have been handled successfully?
Well, I can say that, again, I keep going back to the importance of what your voters care about and where can you find a place that the voters care about the things that you care about? And where can you find a place where you affect change? Or where you think you have the ability to affect change. So in Senator McCain's case, you know, he was not from Arizona. It was a little bit different in his situation because his wife was from Arizona, so made it a little bit easier, but still challenging. He tells stories about knocking on every single door and introducing himself to everyone in his own neighborhood and neighborhoods all around the area. So, you know, he had to put in a lot of hard work. Not that any candidate doesn't have to put in a lot of hard work, but just to kind of acquaint himself with the community. And I think that's something that you want to take into consideration. You need to make sure that you are kind of assimilated and maybe give yourself a little bit of time in that community. I think you'd need time just to learn the issues that were important to the voters there. Maybe you want to live there for a year, 2 years. Maybe you want to move and find somewhere else after those 2 years. But like I said, I think the bottom line is that your values and your belief system match up most closely, as close as possible, to the community in which you're running. And so I don't. With Senator McCain, it's a different situation, but he was successful, and I think that was in large part due to the fact that he was willing to introduce himself to a new community.
So you don't think just saying, I'm a citizen of the world, you don't think that will do it?
No, I'm not so sure.
Melissa and I were actually talking about this yesterday. By coincidence, one of the congressional campaigns I worked in Arizona was in the district where McCain was eventually congressman, and he ran. His first race was, I think, 2 years after I came on active duty. But I watched the campaign very closely, and I was extraordinarily impressed by what he did, and to contrast it with what some other people did. First of all, he didn't make a very big visible thing about I'm looking for a place to run, or I've always lived in this neighborhood, but it's a little bit better pickings in this district next door. And there are candidates who have done that and have been tone deaf to how that sounds. He had some tie to the community. It doesn't have to be you live there forever, but you know this is where his wife's family came from, and they have very deep roots in the area. But more importantly than that, he understood the district he was running in. When he got there, he got involved in community affairs. Did he have a mind toward running for Congress? Yeah. But he got involved in the community, and he went out and went to voters, much as Hillary Clinton did very successfully in New York, and said, look, I'm here not as the outsider come to save you from yourselves because I am just so worldly. What is it that you care about? What is it that are the issues that concern you? They're things that I can relate to and understand and articulate based on my experience in the military that I think will help this district, but I want to hear what you think. And it helped that he actually meant it. The other thing was he was keenly aware of the nature of his district. We had done some surveys in that district about 4 years before and found that over 60% of the people in that district had lived there for less than 5 years. If you were going to pick a place where the carpetbagger argument was not going to fly, this was it. But inevitably it came up. He treated it seriously but with enough humor. Yeah, you're right, I haven't lived here a long time. Come to think of it, the longest I've ever been at one address was the Hanoi Hilton. That was his line. Shut that down really, really quickly. John Glenn ran into the same problem when he went back to Ohio after being an astronaut. He was able to shut it down. Pete Dawkins, when he ran in New Jersey, would be asked about this, and it was well known that he had run surveys in 4 or 5 different states. It was well known that he had political ambitions, and yet he would give these speeches about, because in all the places I've traveled all over the world, I've never found people more good and wholesome. I've never found communities more rich and vibrant than here in New Jersey. Well, those of you who are from New Jersey know that the reaction of most people from New Jersey is, yeah, forget about it. But it was not sincere because it really wasn't. It didn't sound sincere because it wasn't. And McCain was very sincere, and after he was elected, he was extraordinarily good at constituent outreach and getting involved in the community. And from then on, I don't think he ever was seriously threatened in a House race, and other much more rooted in Arizona, much more well-known candidates abandoned the thought of running for Senate when he said he was going to run. So it's not something that's impossible to overcome, but it comes back to, again, knowing yourself, knowing your audience, being honest, and demonstrating sincerely and with all your energy why you're running and what you're going to do once you get elected. And voters will respond to that.
And the 4 C's of your message, I mean, and the most important one being credible. Something that I tell people in my business all the time is that perception is not just reality, it's greater than reality. Mm-hmm. So if people perceive something to be true, if they perceive that you are confident and that you completely believe in your values and your issues, I mean, they too will believe it. So I think it's not so much about where you come from, where you were born, where you grew up, but more about how much you believe in where you are now.
Yeah, you have to have faith in the American voters, and you can get very cynical, particularly when you're involved in campaigns like we are, particularly when your candidate loses. But one of the great things about going out and working on the campaign myself this last year, going to New Hampshire, going around knocking on doors, even the people who were not receptive to my candidate or my message, I came away with a much greater appreciation for and a kind of revitalization of my core sense that, you know, this thing called democracy, yeah, it's got some issues, but it works out pretty good because the voters are actually smarter and better attuned to their self-interest than we sometimes give them credit for. And if you're the kind of person who can communicate sincerely why you got into this, because let's face it, it's not a relaxing pastime, why you got into this and what you intend to do, they'll appreciate that.
Okay, we want to thank our panelists for being here today. Thanks so much.